Hi, and welcome to today's discussion. We will be talking about how do project managers manage project risk? Um, and as a veteran project manager, risk is a very key part of your project. But before we start, I thought I'd like to define what project risk is. So there's a couple of definitions which I'm going to read out. The practice of identifying, evaluating, and preventing or mitigating risk to a project that have the potential to impact the desired income. And the Prince 2, which is the generic term for one of the standards out there. The term risk management, as per Prince 2, refers to the systematic application of procedures to the task of identifying, assessing risk, and then planning and implementing risk responses. For risk management to be effective, risks need to be identified, assessed, and controlled. So those are the definitions of risk. What we will be covering during our discussion is really how we can identify project risk, assessing project risk, developing risk risk plans and responses, and then also monitoring and controlling risk throughout the project life cycle. So let's move on to the first area. Let's identify project risk. So really, throughout the project, when you start your project, in the middle of your project, at the end of your project, whatever stage you are, all should be discussing and understanding the importance of risk with your project team. But risks are, as per the definitions I identified, are things that are going to cause a material impact on your project, in the sense of financial cost, delay, change in direction, whatever that might be. And so you need to really understand how to identify project risk. Now, methods of identifying project risk it's part of your planning stage. You start looking at what activities, who's doing what, etc. What techniques. There's a methods. You start brainstorming. Have sessions with your team where you sit and have a brainstorming session of risks they foresee. Because whatever project you do, there are certain risks that you can foresee. For example, would be annual leave, people's holiday. When people are tasked, you need to make sure that you bake that into your plan, such as supplier lead times. Most suppliers have advertised or SLAs or KPIs, service level agreements, or key performance indicators to confirm how long an item or product will be available for your project. And that goes for third party providers providing physical resource, not just physical kit. So all those things you can start thinking of, even things such as major events, depending on your project. If there's things that could impact, I don't know, if you're doing a highway project, for example, and there's a big event that's going which requires a highway, for example, then that would impact you. So things like that, you need to look at those elements and understand what they could be, and then try and work your way around those projects and those risks, and understand how your project will best benefit, or how you can mitigate that risk, so that it impacts as minimal as possible. And ideally, you'd want to avoid the risk if you could. Now, one of the things of identifying project risk is really you need to identify who, work with your team members, your stakeholders, everybody who you can, and constantly assess where you are with the project. That constantly will identify risk. Is that a risk? Really bring it up and that question people around risk. That's the only way you can ask this. It's the question you don't ask that will cause the issue for you. Okay, let's move on to the next element. So really, after you've identified your risk, you want to start assessing your project risk, and then understanding how best to mitigate that risk. So once you understand those risks, you really need to assess that with your team, understand the importance of it. Is it a big risk? Is it low risk? Is it medium risk? What impact will it have? Once you've understood that element, you need to then understand how do you avoid the risk. You either mitigate the risk, you transfer the risk, or you accept the risk. Now, to avoid the risk is quite simple. Can you do something else that you just don't have to, so that the risk is no longer available? And that is a win situation for you. Or you put in a risk mitigation plan where you put in a set of activities which say actually to avoid that risk, we can do X, Y, Z steps, which will then stop us from hitting that risk. The other element is we transfer the risk now, and this is quite common with where you outsource to third parties. If it's not a project risk, but it's a supplier risk, you transfer it to them, and they need to mitigate it. And it's a useful tool for you to do that. And then the final one really is, do you accept the risk? Now, sometimes you'll look at it and say, okay, well, actually, we've done everything. We've gone through the avoidance. We tried to mitigate it. We tried to transfer it. We can't do it. Do we just have to accept it and then say, okay, what steps do we have to do to accept that risk and then build it into the plan? Now, that's the last resort. I mean, sometimes it's quite simple. Say, okay, well, it's something we just can't control. We need to do it. Accept the risk and we move on. And that's got to be done. But make sure that you are always informing your stakeholders about these risks so they understand how it impacts your projects. Again, you need to involve your team members. Again, you need to involve all your stakeholders because they have the skill set to understand and make sure that these risks you are trying to assess, etc., give you a clear steer. Next is developing risk responses. So really what you've done, you're assessing your project risk. Again, when you develop the risk response, again, like I said earlier, it falls into the categories of risk avoidance, risk mitigation, risk transfer, and risk acceptance. And you need to develop the plan accordingly. Once you understand those, you develop a plan, bake that into your plan, and that comes into ensuring your stakeholders and your team players are fully engaged. Again, as part of that process, you need to understand the likelihood of the risk actually happening. Will it happen, won't it happen, etc. And the more likelihood it is, the more time you need to spend on it. If it's very unlikely, I suggest that you don't spend too much time on it. Otherwise, you can spend too much time looking at things that are not important. We have covered some of most of the development risks earlier, just in our conversation. But again, developing risk response plans, it doesn't have to be a very detailed process, but it does help to have sufficient information so you understand it. Next, I'll cover how you can monitor and control these risks, which are quite key for what you need. So the next one really is, let's move on, is monitoring and controlling risk. So once you've done all, you've identified it, you've assessed it, you've developed a risk response, etc., you need to continually monitor and control the risks. Now, the best method I have used is use a RAID log. RAID log is risks, actions, issues, and dependencies. Now, those are a log that you can create, really simple. You can find plenty on Google or examples. Many organizations have their own version of a RAID log, however, which has the ability to track and monitor the risk that you have identified. Remember, as a project manager, you cannot remember everything. So when you write something down, it rejogs your memory, it helps you progress through the project, and it's really, really important that you understand it. So if you understand it, you can articulate it, and if you can articulate it, you can then understand how best to engage with your team and get the necessary response. Now, as part of the control, like I said, RAID log is a really important tool. You can use any form you want to log it, but I've always used the RAID log as a good go-to central point to keep the project at hand. You put all your responses in. Your RAID log will have, such as the risk number, which you can tally against your project plan. It will have a brief description, a detailed description, a RAG status. Now, RAG is red, amber, green. So the obviously, red needs to really be focused on. Amber needs, probably a medium threat. Green is something, we can accept. So again, that helps you visually, aiding you to understand the importance without having to read so much and focus on the red items, for example. And then you can put in use a risk scale, the likelihood of impacting, and we can go into risk scales in a bit more detail on the next conversation. And then again, you need to be monitoring this regular. And how do you do that? Again, if you're doing stand-ups, you wouldn't cover it in stand-ups, but you would do separate meetings. To cover that, again, if you're following a traditional path of project management in Prince 2, you'll have regular project meetings where you would cover risk and review those with the team. And again, I'll reiterate it, you need to make sure that you've assessed it with your team players, who are the key to giving you the necessary information to how best to respond to risk. Now, it doesn't matter what anybody says, every project will have a degree of risk. It's how easily you identify it and how best you manage it. So overall, realistically, I've given you a quick brief introduction of what, a definition of what risk is. And those are pretty generic, but ultimately risk is anything that's going to impact your project, either physically, materialistically, or financially, that you need to assess, and that's going to take you off track of your project. And as we said, the process is, identify the risk, assess the risk, develop the risk response, and then monitor and control throughout the project life cycle. Thank you for today.